Hello, and welcome to the Home Mastering Masterclass Q&A. First things first, there's a couple of you said you'd like to join me on the call. If that includes you, then I've dropped a link in the chat area to the right-hand side of this video. So feel free to click on that and join me in the Hangout if you would like to. If not, you're welcome to just watch, and I will try and keep an eye on the comments as we go. If you're here, let me know, because I will try and prioritize questions from people who are here first. And feel free to ask follow-up questions in the chat or on the Hangout if you would like. So there's a bit of a delay on the feed, so I'll just kind of wait for 20 seconds, half a minute or so, just to make sure if anybody wants to say anything, they can do. Oh, Darko, hi, welcome. Yep, feel free to click the link if you would like, but no pressure. I'm kind of used to talking to myself on these things these days, so that's fine if you would prefer. If you do decide to click the link, please close the YouTube window. Otherwise, we will, or there's a risk that you'll get kind of feedback looping through, because you'll hear what we've just said kind of 10 or 20 seconds after we say it coming back out of the speakers, and then it gets horribly confusing. That doesn't seem to be happening yet, and I'm not seeing anybody else in the, where's my window? It's an open invitation. Feel free to join if you would like. So what I will do is kick things off with a question from David, who says, in the last video, I noticed that when you change the level using or change the gain using the first plugin in the chain, you don't seem to care about the change that makes in the behavior of the multiband compression. I always thought that when setting up compressors, you should aim for the appropriate gain reduction and mostly stick to it. Instead, you're using it similarly to how you would use a limiter. Am I right? As a default, as a starting point, David, yes. You're going to see, I think, as you go through the course, that there are some songs where I do change those settings and kind of use it differently. But actually, I mean, even when I tweak the settings, I also carry on using it in the way that you've seen me doing it. So I do. It's a question of pushing the gain into the compression, just like it pushes into the limiter later in the stage. So the louder the song gets, the more compression that occurs. And if I hear too much compression, then I will either decide to tweak the settings of the compressor or possibly pull the level back. And I've just found I was going to say that was the way that I was trained to do it, but actually I was trained initially to master using only EQ and limiting. So I was trained in that way, but without any compression at all. And my approach kind of evolved from that. I had the very first limiter I used was it was the Aphex Dominator, which is a fantastic name, which was a broadcast analog limiter, but it was multiband, and it was kind of intelligent in the sense that it would act as a limiter if you were using it kind of very gently, and then it would also apply some more compression-like behavior if you pushed it really hard. So I got you, and there were no thresholds or anything with that. You just turn up the input gain with the settings that you were happy with, and that's what you got. And that's kind of, I used that for the first 2 or 3 years of my career and my training. And I think then when other more sophisticated tools like the TC Electronic M5000, which was the kind of the mainframe version of what later became the Finalizer, when that first came out, we were one of the first places to get hold of that. That was one of the first digital compressors that I used, and I set that up to work in a very similar way. So I kind of used it as a better version of what I already had, and I've kind of carried on using that methodology ever since. So yes, it's a question of balancing the amount of gain that I want with the amount of compression that I'm hearing, with the amount of limiting that I'm getting. And sometimes you'll see me kind of adjust things. So I might bring the thresholds down, for example, so I'm getting more compression. I might tweak the output gain of the compressor going into the limiter so that there's more or less limiting happening. I adjust those kind of balances, but not as often as you might think. I would say that the kind of the approach that you see me using on the course is what I use like 75–80% of the time, maybe, and then the other 20 or so % of the time I'm tweaking individual settings, and that's usually to go for example, more aggressive ratio with a higher threshold, so that I get a harder hitting sound. That's the kind of thing that I might do. Or I might decide to not have any compression at all happening in one of the bands, for example. So yeah, hopefully that helps, David. Now I can hear that somebody else has joined me on the call. Let me see. Oh, okay, well, that's Infinitonica. Hi, Infinitonica. What's your name?
Sabrog.
Hi, Sabrog. Good to see you here. I'm going to mute you temporarily. Well, actually, no, it's okay. If you move around, you'll take over the screen, but it's not the end of the world. And what I'll do actually is, let me just, I don't have a note of a specific question from you yet. So I'll answer a couple more of the questions that I've got prepared, and then I'll come back to you and see if there's anything particular that you wanted to ask. And yeah, let me just see how many, anything else is happening in the chat. No, similar number of viewers. So yeah, feel free to join us if you would like, guys. So question 2 was from Philip, who asks, have you had any experience with SonarWorks headphone calibration system? I use DT770 Pro 80 ohm headphones. Would I be better off upgrading my headphones instead or as well? For example, Sennheiser HD600s or Biodynamic DT990 Pros. Speaker-wise, I have Yamaha HS8 and a pair of IK Multimedia iLoud speakers, currently in a largish bedroom. First of all, Philip, I'm curious to think what you think of the iLoud speakers. I hate the name, but that doesn't mean they're bad speakers. So, I have some feedback.
I'm trying to get sorted here. Come on.
There you go. That worked.
Oh, right. Yeah, I'm on my laptop, just swapping computers. Yeah. Well, the iLoud, they're really general speakers. I think they're great. They're really good. They tend to be probably a bit bassy compared to the my Yamaha monitors.
Right.
But for just general listening, I use them all the time. So they're good just as a general speaker.
Yeah, because they're quite small, aren't they?
Oh, they're tiny. Yeah. They're downstairs at the minute, but yeah, they're tiny. Yeah, just like mini speakers from a normal computer.
Yeah.
I think the sound's good.
That's good to hear. In terms of, I haven't, well, the only Biodynamic headphones I've ever tried I didn't like, which is not to say there's anything wrong with them. It's probably just, I can't even remember what model they were. So I wasn't a fan of them. So I can't really comment on whether you would be better off getting Sennheisers or anything else. I can comment on the SonarWorks.
Yeah.
So because lots of people kept asking me about it. So I contacted them and they gave me a copy of the software. And my initial impression, I have to say, was that so I tried it with the 650s. And they have the kind of the average setting, you know, where the kind of built in, there's a setting for the like HD650s or the 600s or whatever.
Yeah.
And I tried that and I thought, well, it definitely improves the bass end. I mean, so the 650s have, they're noticeably warm in the kind of 100 to 200 hertz region, and they're a little bit dull in the very high top end. So there's a temptation to push the high top too much if you can't rely completely on the sound. So they helped with both of those things. The bass for me was more successful than the top. I mean, my test whenever I'm evaluating anything these days is to always just listen to recordings sort of from my back catalog, stuff that I've mastered before that I know really well.
Yeah.
And if it sounds right to me, then I decide that whatever I'm listening to is good, and if it doesn't, then I decide that it doesn't. I mean, that's not necessarily a valid way to proceed, except that, you know, I've had good responses to my work over the years, so it can't be a million miles out. But then they reached out to me again, kind of independently, and asked whether I tried the software, and I said, well, yes, but I didn't think there's much of it, and that you know, I thought I should try getting the individual calibration for the headphones, but I didn't want to send my pair of headphones away, and they actually sent me a calibrated pair, which is that pair there. So I have now tried it with the custom calibration curve, and I was going to say it makes a big difference. It makes a subtle but really important difference, I would say.
Yeah.
So whereas before I would listen to things that I've worked on, I think, yeah, it's still not quite sounding right to me, or I'd compare it to what I was hearing on the monitors and think, it's, you know, it's better, but it's not right. With the custom calibration curve, when I listen to it, I'm basically completely happy. Which is not to say that personally I would be comfortable working on headphones all the time. I did an episode of the podcast where I talked to Glenn Schick, who does master on, he's got Audi's LCD somethings, I think, or some other planar magnetic headphone, super expensive, but he masters on a laptop all around the world. And I mean, we talked about it on the show, and he kind of, there is definitely, it's a separate skill. You know, I've kind of honed my skills working on monitors rather than on headphones. So I use the headphones as kind of a second opinion or a backup. Or if I'm doing a video or something where I don't want to have stuff coming through the monitors. So that's kind of as far as it goes. I definitely, if I didn't have the custom calibration, I wouldn't be trusting myself with really fine, detailed changes to the height or the top end. I would kind of stick to the broad brushstrokes. I think with that custom calibration, I'd be much more confident. So now, whether that's better or worse than upgrading your current pair of headphones, how much do the 770s come in at?
About just about £100, 120.
You can't kind of draw comparisons necessarily on the price, but for instance, I had Sennheiser 450s, which I think were about £75 when I bought them. At which point the 650s were £200 or £300, which they still are. They were nice headphones. I got used to them. I used them for a long time, but these are better. I mean, I think one of the key things about the 650s is they have very low distortion, which is really important, because if there's a lot of distortion in the headphones, it can mask distortion that's there in the signal, which when we're mastering and making choices about limiting and compression and stuff is really important not to be fooled. So probably the answer is both. I mean, I
thought that would be the answer.
The good news is that the 600s, I haven't tried the 600s, but lots of people say they're basically 650s, but a cheaper build. So you probably don't have to. Having said that, I think you can get 650s for the similar price these days. So, I mean, the 650s were what I bought when I just decided, okay, I need a decent pair of headphones, and it was just, they're a bit like NS10s. You know, they're a bit of an industry standard. That's why I went for them, and I was perfectly happy with them. And having got the SonarWorks running on them, I think, you know, that takes another level. For me, if I had thousands of pounds to spend, I wouldn't be spending it on headphones. I'd go. There are other things that I would spend the money on. On the other hand, if you don't have a pair of monitors, I mean, I've heard really good things about the Yamahas as well. I haven't used them myself. I think I would say suck it and see. You know, you can download the free demo of the SonarWorks and just see how that changes the sound of the 770s and how you feel about that. Does it take them closer to the Yamahas, or does it not? You know, that kind of thing, that might give you an idea. But the other thing to do is just try using the techniques on the course, and see how far you can get. because I mean, people always kind of say the common question is it actually possible to master in a home environment? And the answer is yes. It's just, I mean, I always say this, it's just in general, having all of this amazing gear and amazing rooms and all the rest of it is really, really nice and probably makes life a lot easier. You know, I have tried working in untreated rooms, for example, and it's a complete nightmare. It just makes you end up second guessing yourself, not being sure what you're hearing, you know, all the rest of it. So the more time and effort you can invest in the monitoring environment one way or another, the things are going to get, you know, the better the results you're going to get. But exactly how much bang for your buck you get, and you know what kind of standard you're trying to achieve, it's kind of hard to say. Does that? Hopefully that helps.
Yes, that's right. Yes, it is actually. Sort of circuit and see, but I have actually used the SonarWorks. So you did use the trial, and I think it just boosted the top end a lot on the, slightly on the headphones, which was it did make a very subtle difference, but it was noticeable. I think it helped really.
I mean, for me, I find it very hard. So when I was using, I used the 650s to do the videos on this course. Right. I actually had an EQ in the master output section in Wavelab, or the software when I was using it, which had a little bit of a dip in the 1 to 200 region that I mentioned, and a little bit of a lift. So to try and compensate a little bit for the sound of the 650s. And in one of the videos, which I think is the one that has Believe by Joe Gilder, forget which week number it is, I think I forgot to have that in. And as a result, when I get to the final video of the series where I put them all together, I realize that I've slightly overcooked the top end on that master, and I tweak it a little. So, and the reason I'm saying that is, for me, I find it hard to kind of listen to something and go, okay, so I need to compensate for what I'm hearing by doing. I prefer to just hear it and react intuitively to what I'm doing. And actually, this relates to a question that I'm going to come on to in a second that Scott had. I'd kind of find it, if I was having to work on 650s all day, every day, without some kind of compensation for the sound of them, it's kind of like it's a bit like trying to have a conversation in a crowded environment, you know, or with a screaming baby in the background or whatever it is. It kind of increases your CPU overheads somehow. You know, it just makes everything that a little bit harder. So I think for me, but on the other hand, everybody gets used to stuff, and you can learn things, and the more you do it, the more natural it becomes. So maybe we'll leave that answer there, because I'm going to talk about stuff like that with Scott.
That's fine. That's good. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no problem. So Darko, hi, I can see you're on the call. And Sounds, I don't know who Sounds is, I'm afraid, but welcome. Feel free to unmute yourselves and jump in, you guys, if you want to ask follow-up questions or anything. Oh, now I can see you. Sounds. What's your name? Sorry. Sounds. Can you hear me? What was your name? Oh, I can't hear you. Sorry. No, that was okay. You were unmuted. It must not have recognized your mic. Never mind. You can drop it into the chat. Oh, no, hang on. Now I can hear you. Oh, no, I can't. It's a cat. Come on. Okay, so let's carry on.
May I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I noticed that you're mostly using like EQ, multiband compression, and then final limiting. And I find myself using like maybe 2 or 3 additional plugins which I only use for color. For example, like SPL Iron, or I don't know, Magnum K. So basically like limiters, which compressors, which I only use for like 1 or mostly 2 dB of compression, but I feel it gives master a little bit more analog feel. So do you, let's say, approve usage of
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's say 5 or 6 or so plugins, because I see that you tend to use as little as you can.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely very minimalist, and I think there's a benefit to that in the sense that I like the idea of being minimalist. I like the idea of doing as little as possible. So, for example, one of the reasons I always adjust the gain first is that, I mean, if you don't, then you end up having to tweak everything once you do adjust the gain, because it changes the way you hear the sound.
Yeah, sure.
But also, sometimes you adjust the gain and that's all that needs to happen. And if that's the case, and that's what the mastering of that song entails, then I'm completely happy with that. So, or if it's just a gain change and a bit of EQ and no compressions needed, no limitings needed, then that's great too. So, having said that, okay, and then the other, I think the risk with having lots of plugins that all do something similar is what I've seen people kind of in YouTube videos is they'll come in and they'll say, okay, so I'm going to apply this EQ, and then I'm going to use the compressor to control it, because now it's sticking out a bit at such and such a frequency. But now the compressor has taken away a bit of the life, so I'm going to add in a little bit of top end. And now that's a little bit harsh, so I'm just going to compress it gently again. So they're kind of moving. It's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or whatever. And that to me, it feels messy. It feels confusing. I worry that you would end up over processing things using that method. So I'm cautious about having lots of plugins in the chain for that reason. But having said that, there's certainly no reason not to use plugins for color if you like them. I mean, I think so. I was trained, my first limiter was analog, but I was using digital EQ from the outset. So I've always mastered with a kind of a minimum of 4-band fully parametric EQ, which when I started was still quite rare. And I always, because there's lots of engineers who still reach for analog processing, and again, there's nothing wrong with that. But often one of the limitations of the analog processing is that it doesn't have all of that kind of surgical control of all of the bands. You know, it'll either have stepped frequency choices or Q values, or maybe gain changes and things. So, and it's just 2 different ways of working. You know, somebody will reach for a particular EQ unit because they know that it's got a really, it's got a great lift at 60 hertz or something with a nice tight Q, like for example. Or something. If you have something like Pultec EQ where you kind of get that. I mean, it's a shape that you often see me achieve in mastering, where there's a boost and then there's a dip, or vice versa. You can do that with the Pultec EQ, and if you know the Pultec EQ inside out, then you can just reach for it and dial it in, and you're done. Whereas I just prefer to have a completely flexible digital EQ and get the exact EQ shape that I would like, as opposed to having 2 or 3 EQ units. So I think they're just different ways of working. I mean, I would recommend that you're careful that you're not accidentally kind of pushing and pulling in different directions with the different processors, and not kind of, certainly not have everything in there by default. It's like they can be there switched off, but try the minimalist approach first. I think, especially in mastering, that's kind of a good way to go. But, I certainly don't disapprove of that way of working, or feel it's wrong or anything, because at the end of the day, if it gets the results that you like, then that's great.
It's just top end. I think. I mean, it feels that it's a little bit. I recently mastered EDM and things like that. So it's mostly samples and all artificial stuff. And top end was a little bit too grainy or not not glued together or something like. And with this, let's say, those analog emulation which color top end a little bit, I think I got a little bit more like mellow or glued together top end, which is like impossible to get with just FabFilter EQ and some other processors.
Yeah, I think
this is why I'm using, for example.
And I think that's valid. Definitely. Again, I forget which week it is. I do a metal track in one of the videos, and kind of just use some saturation techniques to kind of to get some more aggression and kind of it feels too clean to begin with. So I mean, it's interesting because everybody talks about the analog versus the digital thing, and for me, I think it's a bit of a red herring. It's you know, often people talk about the fantastic warm sound that old analog recordings have, and I've remastered a lot of them over the years, and quite often they're just dull. And the thing that people like about them is they have less top end. And if you talk to, I haven't actually talked to Trevor Horn, but if I've heard him interviewed talking about analog versus digital, he's saying, you know, that all of those guys, we now kind of look back with rose-tinted spectacles at those analog days for all of the kind of the magic that was in that gear. But the engineers at the time were desperate to get rid of it and were screaming out for digital because, you know, every time you played an analog tape, you lost a little bit of the top end. And it was just a constant struggle to preserve all of that clarity and that space and the open stuff. So it's definitely, it's just different perspectives, and it's just different, you know, and I've used, I think I experiment in one of the videos with the T-Rex EQ, I think, which has a kind of an analog EQ mode, and decide that I quite like it. And I'm the same. I'm always kind of looking out for those things. My instinct tells me that you can almost always get the same result in some other way. So if it's a lack of glue in the high end, then maybe a little bit of multiband compression, a little bit heavier processing in the high frequencies might work, or maybe it's a little bit of saturation. But you know, if whether it's actual analog gear or whether it's an emulation of analog gear or whether it's digital gear that you use in some particular way, you know, providing it gets the result that you want, then it's all good, you know. There's a I always say there's a kind of if that's the total range of possible recorded sounds that you could put on in a digital file, I'm probably mastering somewhere in this kind of range here. But outside of that, there's a bigger range of stuff that's out there that everybody thinks is completely acceptable, you know, and in that range, it's just a question of taste, and my taste is there, but yours might be here, or somebody else's might be. So, you know, providing we're not kind of the kind of the golden rule is do no harm, right? So providing, and of course harm is subjective, because, you know, there are people who push the levels to insane degrees that I think is harm, but they think is a benefit. So it all depends. But I think providing we're careful that what we're doing is only making things better, then, you know, it's fine. Pretty much anything is valid.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
No, pleasure.
Very elaborate answer.
Oh, I'm not good at short answers, as you guys will figure out if you haven't already. So let me remind myself. Okay, Scott is here. I saw that, even though his microphone isn't working. So let me answer. Scott's asked several great questions. The final question, Scott, was about kind of the practicalities of mastering in terms of kind of contracts and dealing with clients and stuff. We actually talked about that as part of the last Mastering Show podcast episode. Not in huge detail, but we did kind of go into it. So if what I can say, rather than dig into all of those questions now, what I'd say is, if you haven't heard it already, if you can check that out, see whether that helps, and then maybe come back with some follow-ups. I mean, John and I have considered doing an entire episode on the practicalities of mastering. So that's certainly something that maybe we could do. So I'd be interested to hear your reaction to that. So maybe if we start there. Your questions were very thorough. So I've tried to shorten some of them. So hopefully I will still have kind of be answering the right question. So question 1, if my limiter has true peak detection, then should I still keep the ceiling of the limiter at -1? I'm thinking that although it would play back fine on most analog equipment, it would probably still be prudent for issues like conversion to MP3. So logically, if I'm keeping it at -1 for that reason, would there be a reason to enable the true peak limiting, since it's unlikely to go over a -1 setting and would just add to the total amount of limiting unnecessary? So yes, I would recommend you still keep the ceiling at -1. And personally, I keep true peak limiting enabled. The main reason, well, that's partly because of the kind of the recommendations to streaming services. It's partly my own personal experience. You're right, it's mainly about conversion, but sample rate conversion or MP3 encoding or any other kind of lossy streaming situation can change the peak data and run the risk of introducing extra peaks that then get clipped further down the processing chain. And the true peak a true peak level is interesting because it's not really it's not an actual peak level, right? It's a prediction, if you like, of what will happen in certain situations. And what I found, excuse me, is that if I stick to -1 true peak and the kind of mastering levels that I recommend on the course, I'm fine. If you push the loudness much higher, then the true peaks that get generated will be much bigger, and -1 won't be high enough. I mean, it'll be high enough in terms of the digital file, in terms of analog playback, but then when it gets MP3 encoded, the peak level changes will be that much more significant, for example. So I did a video somewhere. I don't know whether I linked to it on the course, where I kind of demonstrated how to use the Apple round trip plugin to test for mastered for iTunes compliance, and that gives you a preview. But also, so Wavelab, the latest version, has a codec preview thing in it. The Sonox, I think, make a codec preview. I think the latest version of Ozone has something that enables you to preview how an MP3 will sound, and you can check peak levels there. So that's another option. But short answer is I still stick with -1 true peak. It might give you theoretically a little bit more limiting than you would otherwise get, but I'd prefer to do that and avoid the risk of clipping later on. Question 2 from Scott. If a song has lots of dynamic range, how do you choose what part of song to choose the reference level from? For instance, Jefferson Airplane's White Rabbit looks like a cheese wedge. It builds through the entire song. Do you grab the middle or the end where it's loudest? So I basically use the loudest section of the song. And I set that so that it's peaking kind of +1, +2 on the VU. Or if you're using a loudness meter, that would be -10, -9 LUFS, short term. And then everything else scales to that loudest section, musically speaking. So if I have a song where I set the loudest section to kind of follow that rule, so we're talking about, roughly speaking, an LUFS or an RMS of -9 with a -1 peak level. So you've got 8 dBs difference again between the peak and the loudness. If you then go to one of the quieter sections of the song and it sounds too quiet, then I would consider using some automation to bring that section of the song up. So, that's a situation where I'm reducing the macro dynamics of the music to work in a mastering context, but without using compression necessarily. Because if it's quiet, and going back to that previous question that we had, where I'm just riding the gain into the compression and the limiting, if it's still quiet, there may still not be any extra compression in that section of the song. It's more like manual compression, if you like. It's kind of like riding a fader, the way they used to do it back in the day. And I do that sort of maybe on 1 in 5 projects, or perhaps 1 in 5 songs on a project, maybe. You know, just depends how it. I mean, I've had this myself. I've mixed stuff myself, and then when I come to master it, I know you shouldn't technically master your own stuff, but I do sometimes. I give myself a bit of a time to come back to it. It's quite common that I find I want to reduce that dynamic contrast between sections of the song, because when I'm mixing, I crank the monitor volume up. I don't have a fixed reference level. The loud bits are really loud and the quiet bits sound fine because the monitoring level is really loud. But one of the things that we're after in mastering is that translation, and that's about dynamic management. That's about getting those kind of fine-tuning those balances between sections of songs and from one song to another. So yeah, loudest section of the song is the kind of the benchmark. Scott, hopefully that helps. Question 3. After spending a day of listening to pink noise and tweaking the EQ settings on my monitors with tiny amounts to make the frequency response curve at my listening position completely flat in the analysis software I have, all my reference tracks sounded totally dead and flat too. So the next day, in frustration, I just redid the whole thing the old school way and made the monitors sound good to me with the reference tracks, as you suggested, and like I used to do at the venues I mixed at. Scott was explaining in his email that he's got years of experience mixing in live venues. And oh, so can you comment on why this is? I thought that when we were mastering, we were supposed to try and get things as flat as possible. Is tuning the room or the listening position to a flat frequency response curve unnatural to our ears? Is it actually counterproductive to try and achieve that? Do you know if the really high-end mastering professional studios of the past, big record companies, for example, tuned their rooms completely flat? Is it just the frequency response at the output of the speakers themselves, all that we need to be concerned with? Am I doing something wrong? So, in theory, you're right. We want the flattest possible listening scenario we can have. And the idea is that if you have a kind of this average system, not average in terms of quality, but average in terms of right in the middle of, you know, if there's a PA system at a club with a massive subwoofers kind of at one end of the spectrum, and then a smartphone speaker at the other end in terms of lack of bass, we want to be somewhere in between those two extremes. The idea is that if you get it to sound balanced and right on that kind of middle of the road system, if you like, that flat, neutral is a good word, system, then when that song is taken to the club with a huge PA or to a smartphone speaker or wherever, it will sound right in comparison to everything else on that system. Having said that, this room here isn't completely flat, and none of the mastering studios that I've worked in have been completely flat either. Bob Katz, who I'm sure some of you have come across, says that his monitoring system is flat to within some tiny degree of tolerance. I certainly don't think that's essential. Again, it kind of comes back to that. It's probably easier, you know, but because I mean, so to take an extreme example, you know, if the monitoring system isn't flat, you have to start compensating for it, just like the HD650s. A little bit dull in the very high end, a little bit too much low mids. It kind of, you have to bear that in mind when you're processing stuff, if you're just listening on those. If your room has a big null at a certain frequency, you've got to tailor the mixes. You listen to songs that sound great everywhere else in there, the reference tracks, and they sound a bit weird, and you have to make your stuff sound a bit weird to make it sound like them. That all makes everything harder. So if that's the case, I think you definitely want to get closer to a flat situation. But like in here, this room is flat enough that I can make good judgments. I can hear whether things are right or wrong and whether they need improving or not, without the room having to be completely flat or the response to be completely flat. And the same applies to mastering studios. So I don't know whether this is true, but it's been alleged that one of the main mastering rooms at Abbey Road has a graphic EQ hidden away underneath the desk with some room nodes tweaked out on it. My good friend Nick Watson, who's now at Fluid Mastering, worked at the Townhouse for years, which sadly is no more. He was in a custom-built acoustically designed mastering studio, and he said there was a huge null at 100 hertz at the monitoring position, which he found very frustrating. So I think that there are mastering rooms out there that are incredibly flat, and there are mastering rooms out there that are not especially flat. And the key thing that you've got to deal with, Scott, is the fact that you've got years and years of experience and learning using systems that are not flat, live situations, and the system you're using to monitor at home, or where you're working. And so that's the flip side of it, right? Even if we're not working, like I'm used to listening things in this little room now, it's not flat, but I'm used to the ways in which it's not flat, and they sound kind of normal to me. You know, there's nothing wildly wrong, and I know the kind of little quirks and kind of bits that might not be quite right, and I can adjust to that. I mean, even in terms of speakers, I like B&W monitors, Bowers and Wilkins. They tend to be fulsome in the bass. In comparison to, they're quite a popular brand of speaker and mastering circles. There's another brand which would be the PMCs, which are not fulsome in the bass at all. As far as I'm concerned, they sound a little bit dry, a little bit tight, a little bit clinical. I like to hear a big, warm, low end. So my taste is probably to have a little bit more of that going on than PMCs might give me. Now, I'm sure if I worked in a studio where with correctly set up PMCs for long enough, I would be able to adjust and compensate and get used to that and get great results. I just happen to like the B&W sound, that kind of big, full, exciting sound. So possibly not completely flat and neutral. So this is a very long and rambling question for a kind of way of saying, you know, the monitoring needs to be, I think with everything in mastering, it needs to be good enough. So, you know, if you can't master on earbuds because there's so much distortion and limited frequency response and all the rest of it in the sound that it's going to mask all kinds of problems in the source recording, and you're not going to be able to cope with that. But that doesn't mean you have to have $50,000 or $100,000 monitors to get good results. Providing the system and the gear that you're using and every aspect of it is good enough, then you'll be in good shape. So yeah, it's kind of it's sort of halfway in between the two. And yes, in an ideal scenario, then you should be going for something that's as flat and as neutral as possible. But if that's messing with your head and you prefer something that's not like that, then, you know, don't worry about it. Carry on. Somebody's just joined the call, and I'm just going to mute your microphone, if that's okay. Can I do that here? No, I need to do that there. No, here. Control room. Okay, fine. How do I switch back to me now? Bear with me, I've lost my window. Let's try this. Okay. Now I've lost my questions. Final question. I hope that helped, Scott. I know your mic's not working, so feel free to drop some questions in the chat if you wanted any follow-up on any of this. He asked, do you not favor Melder Production plugins anymore? There's nothing wrong with Melder Production plugins are still very good. I used them in the original course, and at the time I was promoting Melder Production plugins. In fact, I'm flattering myself, but I think I had quite a lot to do with helping expand their reach. Then I came up with the Perception plugin, and about 6 months after I released it, they released a cheap ripoff of it, even though we were friends and I was promoting their plugins. So on the one hand, I kind of understand that, it's a cutthroat business, plugin design, manufacturing, all the rest of it, but it just kind of soured my enthusiasm for them. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with them. They're great plugins. They have some great plugins. I just don't promote and recommend them anymore. But that's kind of for selfish reasons rather than anything more technical or for any particularly good reason. I mean, in terms of what I like at the moment, I really like the FabFilter stuff, I have to say. It's not really that they sound particularly any better than anything else, but the interfaces are really, really well designed. They're, little things like in the EQ being able to solo a band with a single click of a button, sensible choices about parameters, the way things work. They're reliable, they're clearly laid out. I really like those. My favorite mastering stuff is probably still the TC MD plugins that come with the System 6000. So that's the MD4 stuff, and I have the MD3 stuff here in the PowerCore system there. I think I use it on a few of the videos in the series. But honestly, the box is a bit of a pain on a current OS. The drivers don't work especially well. Bouncing is a lot slower than using native plugins. So I'm using it less and less because I can get results that are just as good with other plugins. What else am I liking at the moment? Well, it's a Spider-Man plugin. With great power comes great responsibility, but the Irksound Soothe plugin can be just the thing sometimes when you have something that's really, really harsh and just needs calming down a bit. You have to be really careful because it will eat your mix alive if you're not careful. But that's quite a good one. I'm kind of constantly experimenting with different things. DMG plugins are really good. I haven't used, everybody's talking about, oh no, hang on, do I mean DMG? I'm actually going to have to, there's DMG Limitless, which is a multi-band limiter, which I haven't tried. Everybody talks about it, and I haven't tried it yet. I just kind of, I don't know why. I don't really feel the need for a new limiter, and I'm not sure about a multi-band limiter either. But I'm trying to remember the names of the ones. Wavelab is taking forever to start. I was going to look. So there's, there we go. Stage 1 and Leapwing. That's the name I'm looking for. Leapwing Audio. There's Stage 1, which is a stereo processing tool that I'm experimenting with at the moment. They have one called Center 1, which allows you to mess with the center channel of the mid signal. There's a video coming up about mid-side processing, and I go into that, but these are kind of more advanced than that. So yeah, those are some of the kind of the ones at the moment. But I'm constantly experimenting and interested to try new stuff. I mean, one of the themes of the course that I genuinely believe is it ain't what you use, it's the way that you use it. I think the kind of results that I'm teaching on the course you can get with almost any decent digital EQ, compressor, limiter setup. So I don't want to get too drawn into the this or that plugin, because the things like the ones I mentioned, they're the kind of the 10% or 5% or less of projects. Most projects, it's EQ, compression, and limiting, and that's it. Maybe a little bit of soft clipping, that kind of thing. Yeah, so hopefully that satisfies your curiosity. And as I say, Scott, take a look at the podcast episode that I mentioned. It's the Q&A 6, the most recent episode, where we answered a question about the practicalities of kind of running a mastering business and things, and that will answer some of your questions, and then you can come back and I will look in more detail at the questions that you asked and see, either do maybe another Q&A call where I kind of specifically talk about that, or perhaps I'll do that episode of the podcast so that everybody can benefit from that. So I think that's all the questions that I had sent in advance. So the question is whether anybody who is here wants to follow up on anything that I've said, or has a question that they would like me to answer. Anybody watching this who isn't in the call, feel free to drop something into the chat as well. I've got that open here now.
I'd like to ask a question.
Sure.
Like I said, I haven't been able to fully dive into the course because I've been busy this month, but I will in the second half. But the question that I thought of just now is, I think one of my goals is I'm not just a audio engineer. I'm also a musician and things like that. And I think I'm somewhat of a naturalist in terms of my aesthetic of what I really like. And I think one of my ultimate goals is to do, which I really like your approach, and why I'm really attracted to your work is you do as minimal stuff as possible. And I think kind of the ultimate mastering, as you said, kind of sometimes is almost no mastering, like if nothing needs to be done. So I guess I'm wondering, as a sort of a general overview of your experience, what are some things that you see on a regular basis from mixes and masters and these recording processes that could be fixed in earlier on, perhaps in the recording process or in the mixing, that if when we're recording something, mixing something, what tips do you have to avoid that they could put you out of business, kind of?
Okay, so I'll come to that in a second.
Yeah.
I mean, you didn't really ask this, but I think one interesting thing to say on this topic is that so sometimes I get an album that comes in and I think, wow, this sounds amazing. This just sounds incredible. Really, I actually would be happy to let this just go out exactly as it is. And when that happens, I say so to the client. And almost always they say, well, we're here now, what would you do if, fair enough, we appreciate that, thank you very much, but is there anything? And then, so you kind of, my experience is that I say, well, I suppose maybe we could tweak that one up by a dB or half a dB, and actually, maybe I could have a tiny little bit of bass there, and then you start going into it, and suddenly it's 4 to 6 hours later, and you spent just as much time working on it as you do on the projects where you're kind of digging in with every processor known to man. Tiny little changes on every song that add up to something much, much bigger. It's one of the things that I think is slightly magical about the process is that when you've got something that's that good, you can still make what seem to be amazing improvements with tiny little changes. It really can make a difference whether one song is half a dB louder or quieter, and whether this one has half a dB of 10K or whatever it is, these little things. So that's the jobs that come in that sound that good to me are rare, partly because I'm just opinionated and fussy, but also because I think it's really hard to get all of this stuff right at the mixing stage. So I mean, even if it sounds like your goal is kind of, I would like to create a recording and a mix that doesn't need any more work, and I think that's an admirable goal. But I would say
the minimal pause,
So even if you achieve that, I would still take the time to give yourself a mastering step, even if all you eventually do is listen through to it and go, yep, I did it. Because I think almost always you will go, I nearly did it, and there will be those little changes to make. I think there's almost always benefit in that, just the kind of the stage of reflection, if you like, just stepping back and seeing everything from a distance and not being in the thick of all of the other details that get. That's why I recommend having mastering and mixing as separate stages as much as anything. I mean, partly it's about the objectivity, partly it's about practicalities. Well, and one of the big things is just not having the headspace to be thinking about the level of the kick versus the snare or whatever at the same time as whether this song fits against that song over there, and whether the emotional build through the album works, and whether the overall color is right and all that kind of stuff. But I think the answer to the other part, or to the question you actually asked, is not going to be necessarily that helpful, because it's kind of like everything. I mean, so it needs to be. There's no point in recording a bad song or a bad piece of music, so that needs to be good. Then you need people who can play it well and perform it well. You need an arrangement that works. You know, if you've got things fighting in the arrangement, then everything becomes a struggle from there on in. I mean, it's the classic thing. Everybody's had this. You have an album, a collection of songs. One of them just mixes itself and sounds amazing, and the other one you sweat blood over for days, and it ends up sounding okay, but it's still not quite right. And it's probably because it's not quite in tune, you know, or something wasn't quite right. The performer was having an off day or whatever. So the more of all of that you can get right, the better. I think the things that kind of spring to mind, one of them is the room. So to take an extreme example, I once had somebody send me something where the vocals sounded so bizarre. I said, "You're not in a square room, are you?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm actually in the room's more or less a cube," which is acoustically the worst possible shape, because you've got the same distance in every direction. Yeah. So all of the reflections that happen within the walls are the same. So you get all the problems that introduces are kind of multiplied by 3 or more, if you like. It probably goes up by the square or something. So the mic was right in the center of the room. So it was the worst possible situation. And we did manage to improve it and get a better result. But that's a big thing, a decent sounding room. Or if it's not a good sounding room to begin with, then a room that's got some treatment to help it. Then, I mean, I think the big one is mic placement. Mic placement makes such a huge difference. You know, tiny little changes. You know, I mean, everybody's heard it where the performer moves around and it goes off axis or whatever, and it changes the sound. Those kind of details. So the mic in the right place, so that you're not getting plosives, but you're getting enough high end and all those kind of things. Not being too close. You know, if providing the space sounds reasonably nice, then typically if you're a little bit further back, it will sound more natural and probably better. All of those kind of things. And I think the mixer man, Eric Serafin, has just written a new book, Musician's Guide to Releasing a Killer Record or something. And his whole thing there, it's aimed at musicians, and his basic kind of idea is that actually, if you're a musician, you don't want to get involved in all of this stuff, right? That's a huge kind of rabbit hole that you just don't want to have anything to do with. He suggests instead getting all of these other things right, the performance, the arrangement, everything else. And he says at that point, you kind of don't need to mix or even master, right? Because it will all just fall together and all basically work as it is. And I think that's good advice. I mean, he kind of takes it to extremes, which is just the way that he is. And so I don't think he's kind of using an extreme example to make his point, which is a valid way to explain things. But I don't think people should necessarily take what he says completely literally. But yeah, I think that the things that spring to mind would be the room. The shape of the room is one thing, but also just like what kind of surfaces do you have in there? You know, so this was originally a garage, this little room I have here. And so it had brick, untreated brick on the walls. And I kind of came and I was like, yeah, this is probably going to sound all right. Had it plastered, it sounded horrendous. You know, the change from a natural rough brick surface to a flat, polished, well, not polished, but, you know, skimmed plaster surface. Suddenly it sounded like a bathroom. And I thought, oh no, I made a horrible mistake. This room is going to be unusable. Coat of paint helped. But then after that, bringing in the acoustic treatment, you can't really see it, but I'm looking at a ton of acoustic treatment here, and you can see a couple of the screens at the back. That made a huge difference. And even things like putting carpets down, or you know, building some screens that allow you to kind of control things a little bit. All of that kind of stuff can really help. And really, it's just the more that you can do. I mean, if you've got good enough microphone technique, you know, you see the kind of old school singers who will pull the mic away for the high notes or the loud notes. If you do that right, it's basically like built-in compression. If you do it wrong, it's just as much of a problem as not doing it, because actually things get too quiet because the mic goes too far away, you know, and it also goes roomy and distant when they do that. So But if you can get little strategies like that right, that can all help. So is that the kind of thing you're thinking of?
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of general, mixing audio engineering stuff that kind of heard, and it's good to hear you sum up. I think I was just as a and also I think what you're just the general role of the mastering engineer, having this objective perspective. I think there's something about the human psychology when you're absorbed in something, the certain parts of the brain shut off and don't perceive certain things. It's kind of like, maybe you go to the bathroom, you don't smell yourself. It's like you can't. The brain it's something you can't really even overcome by willpower or experiences. And so maybe that's I'm just part of the role of the mastering engineer, someone like yourself, is someone who's totally out of the environment, come in and just have this fresh perspective, and there's certain things that you just can't avoid kind of going wrong because you just don't perceive them at the time.
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, it's why I suggest sort of having something like a pair of headphones as an alternative monitoring situation, because it just kind of, it removes that whole connection with what you were hearing previously, or if you move into a different situation. But you're absolutely right. And I mean, the thing is, there are bits of it that are unavoidable, because when we're working on a recording or a mix, we know the stories of what helped things become the way that they are. I remember I did I think I did a thing with Joe Gilder and Graham Cochran from Home Studio Corner and the Recording Revolution. They have a site called Dueling Mixes, where every month they have a song, and the two of them mix it, and then everybody gets to compare the two, and the members get to mix the songs themselves as well. And it's a really cool idea. I did a thing with them called Dueling Masters, which you guys will get as a bonus at the end of this course. Spoilers, sorry. And the interesting, I'm pretty sure it's the video that I include with the course. One of the fascinating things about that was I put Graham's mix on. I was like, oh, okay, well, there's a big resonance in the kick drum at whatever it was, 80 hertz or something. That needs to, and I notched it straight out. It took me about 20 seconds. And I talked to him afterwards. He was like, oh, I was really shocked when you did that, because I really liked that quality of the kick drum sound. It's like, I heard that when I was recording. I was like, yeah, that's cool. I'm going to leave that in. But he also appreciated that, because I didn't remove it completely. I just tamed it to the point where it was still a flavor, but because it was a problem. It was I used like a 6 dB notch or something on it. And if I hadn't, there would be some systems where that would have, if the system was already a bit boomy at that frequency, it would just have tipped it over the edge. So for me, from a mastering perspective, it's like, well, that's a kind of anti-translation thing right there. Yeah. And so the point I'm making is he kind of had all these excuses in his head why that was okay to leave. And I came to it completely fresh and was just like, well, no, you can't have that, because it's not going to work. And that's really hard to do for yourself. We can do this stuff like taking a week or 2 weeks break and coming back to something, or listening on separate monitors, and I mean, just the process of bringing all the stereo mixes into a single session and having them lined up and working on them in that way, rather than working on the mix. All of that helps. It's, well, it's like when you first play the mix of something to somebody else, or you show somebody a photograph you've taken and you suddenly realize that, there's a kid in the back kind of photobombing or something. This detail that you've never noticed before suddenly jumps out at you because you're suddenly in that different mindset. And the challenge, if we're mastering our own stuff, is to try and get into that headspace, even though we're the people who possibly recorded and mixed it, and we've got all of these obstacles. So it is really, I mean, it's entirely possible, but it's just difficult.
Right. Yeah.
But it's a great exercise to do, certainly.
Great, thank you.
No, pleasure. Let's just have a look at the chat here. Scott says, thanks, Ian. Do you tell your clients exactly what changes you make to the songs, since they may not understand why it took 6 hours to make one EQ adjustment in the end? Do they quarrel about billing if that's the case? That depends, Scott, honestly. if it's an attended session, you have to tell somebody because they can see. And yeah, I'm completely upfront about it in that case. And particularly if it's, I mean, I think the thing is, it's such a rare situation where you do so little. It's like if I only made one slight EQ change to one song, no, I'm going to contradict myself already, because the thing is that it could still take me 3 or 4 hours. So the average mastering session for me is 4 to 6 hours, and it's the same price whether it takes 4 or 6 hours, or even if it takes 3 hours. But it usually doesn't, because even if I'm going to listen to a whole album of material and end up doing almost nothing, the decision-making process of deciding to do almost nothing takes almost as long as the decision-making process of, you know, because it's like, oh, this doesn't seem to need anything. Okay, I almost maybe listen harder if I feel like I'm going to do nothing, because it's like, well, I don't want to miss anything. So I think at the end of the day, if I came up and I felt, I think it's all about how much genuine benefit there is. If I got to the end of the mastering process and I generally added nothing to the project, I think I might consider offering the clients a discount in that case. But I'm going to say that's never happened. Because even when it's just these tiny little changes and it took me that whole length of time, the benefits are still there and are still appreciable. Having said that, I am very honest. So I usually report back to people. So if it's a remote, if it's an attended session, the client's sitting there, they can hear what's happening. They're part of the A/B process. You know, it's all out in the open. Much more common for me these days is remote mastering. So I usually send people, you know, an email. It's kind of, okay, here you go. Here's the link to the master that you can download so you can listen. And I give them a kind of 1 paragraph sort of summary of, you know, it sounded great, but I felt like it needed tightening up in the low end. And I wanted to kind of get some extra sweetness into the top end without making it sound harsh. So I'm kind of telling them my goals, what I hope to achieve. And strictly between us, that's a useful strategy, right? Because I'm using the benefits of confirmation bias, because one of the things that happens when people hear on their own system a master and they haven't been there for the mastering, is it can sound different to them, and it might not necessarily sound right. You know, if there's a monitoring system where there's a big boost at 100 hertz, which means that they didn't put quite enough 100 hertz in, and I've corrected for that, when they listen to it on that system that still has that boost, it might sound like there's too much to that point. So they might kind of be alarmed by that. So by kind of briefly describing what my goals were and what my aims were in positive language to them in the email, I'm kind of preparing them somewhat for that shock. If they know that I'm aiming to warm up the low end a bit, they're going to be expecting that, which hopefully helps. So, and at that point, if I'd done very little, then I would be honest. I would say, honestly, this only needed really subtle changes, but I feel the benefits are still appreciable. You know, for me, it has more consistency, or it's going to translate better because of this. Or, you know, I kind of explain why it is that I feel that I've brought value to the project, even if the changes involved in bringing that value are very small. And, you know, I mean, there's a risk with that they might come back and go, well, you know what? I'm not hearing that. Sounds almost exactly the same to me. I'm not happy. But that's never happened. I mean, the funny thing is, you know, well, it's not that funny, actually, when you think about it. It tends to be the higher quality of the project, the higher quality of the ears of the person who produced it, right? So the more sensitive they're going to be to those very subtle changes that you make, and probably the more appreciative they're going to be of the perspective that we can bring. So, you know, because I've definitely got clients whose hearing is every bit as good as me. You know, they come to the session and I put the song on, I go, oh, okay, here you go, and I do, and they're like, yes, that's what it needed. You know, they can hear it. They might not have known exactly what frequency it was, and some of them do. Some of them go, "Yeah, I knew it was 72 hertz or whatever it was." So you, from one perspective, you can say, "Well, what are they paying me for?" Because they can hear it themselves. They might even be able to hear it themselves on their home system. And the answer is, it's the objectivity. It's the extra pair of ears. It's a safety net. It's another opinion. I've got lots of experience doing this. You know, they may not want to invest the time and effort. Some of my clients I know just are like, "Oh, I can't be bothered to master it. I'll get somebody else to do it." They're perfectly capable themselves with the gear they have and in the monitoring situation they have and all the rest of it. They just like having somebody else to do it. So, yeah, although in theory, I could imagine a client who might go, "Well, you didn't do anything." It hasn't happened in my 20 plus years. Okay, I'm being honest and thinking, has it really never happened? I genuinely don't think it has. You know, the other situation is much more likely, where I say to people, "I don't know whether this needs it," and they go, "Well, show us what you can do anyway," and you do it, and they go, "Yeah, that's brilliant, fantastic, thank you." So, yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about it. Hopefully that helps. So that's good. And I've run out of questions. And we've been going just over an hour. That's a good length for a Q&A. My voice is starting to get a little bit hoarse. So unless anybody has any other questions just before we go, then I will say thank you very much. Good questions make for a good Q&A. I hope the answers were helpful. If not, then feel free to come back to me with follow-up questions, or if you have other questions from the rest of the course, of course, you can send those in. And yeah, Scott, I'm going to check out all of those practicality questions you have and figure out whether to do another Q&A or whether to do a podcast episode or what. Or maybe you'll listen to the last episode of the podcast and decide that I kind of covered them already. But yeah, in the meantime, thanks a lot for being here. We'll see you for the next one. I hope you enjoy the rest of the course. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.